All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, we are ready for an absolutely riveting conversation on the future of data. And we have with us for this conversation some of the best humans on the planet to chart a course through a very, very complex issue. This is not easy stuff, but the folks on stage will serve as the collective Virgil for our proverbial Dante as we try to make sense of the future of what is one of the most powerful tools that we have to solve problems on the planet right now. I want to introduce our panelists quickly, and then we will ask each of them to say a little bit about the work that they are doing. Seated next to me is Lila Tretikov, who is a partner and the head of AI strategy at New Enterprise Associates. Lila has an amazing history on these issues. Next is Jim Fruchterman. Jim is the founder and CEO of Tech Matters. Jim is kind of a hero in the pantheon of public interest technologists, so wonderful to have you with us, Jim. Next is Sarah Heck, who is the head of policy planning and programs at Anthropic, a little AI company that many of you have likely heard of. Sarah is a longtime friend and former colleague. And then Jon Clifton, who comes at this from a really interesting perspective as the CEO of Gallup, an organization that has really defined the intersection of data and public sentiment, at least in the United States, for a very long time. How many years, John, has Gallup been doing this?
90 years.
90 years. Older than any of us on stage, I think it's fair to say. So wonderful to have you with us as well. I'm going to start by asking each of them to do a quick capsule of the work that they are currently involved in. We're going to keep these very tight, and then we're going to jump into an awesome topic. So Lila, tell us a little bit about what you're doing at NEA.
We're at the epicenter of the AI explosion that's happening with young companies, but the work specifically in data, and of course we invest very heavily in AI and data, but the work that I'm doing right now actually has to do with continuing some of the work that I've done when I was leading Wikipedia. Most of you probably know about that organization. During my tenure there, we brought a lot of AI into the website, and we also brought in or accelerated the project called Wikidata. Most of you probably don't know this, but initial AI models were built and trained almost solely on Wikipedia data. But what we're seeing today is Wikipedia itself even cannot keep up with the proliferation of data and information that's out there. So this, the research work that we're doing at Stanford Oval Lab specifically is around how do we keep up with actually managing this data and managing understanding of facts and truths as we become more and more drowned in the data, especially in synthetic data. You know, internet in a year or so is going to be supposedly 90% synthetic. So that's the focus of my work in that domain, in addition to figuring out how are we actually going to scale all of this.
So this theme of facts, truth, and trust that you just heard Lila talk about is going to be a recurring theme for the course of our conversation today. Jim, tell us a little bit about what you're up to.
So my background is I am a tech entrepreneur from Silicon Valley. I used to start AI companies back in the early ages of that technology. And now what I do is I start nonprofit tech companies. So basically, 90% of humanity is not that exciting a market for most of Silicon Valley. And so what we do is we work with tech companies, the open source community, to build solutions for different parts of the social sector. And so the two big projects that we're working on right now, one is open source technology for the crisis response helpline, taking a telephone-oriented field into the texting era, because young people text a little bit these days. And also technology for farmers, smallholders, and local leaders around the world who are dealing with the front lines of climate change. So that's what we're up to, and you'll hear more about some other things, but I think the fundamental issue is the nonprofit sector is really trusted, but it's 15 years behind the times in its use of technology. And so we're trying to help them do the sensible applications of technology that actually help them get more mission with the limited dollars or whatever currency they have.
So Sarah, nothing going on at Anthropic. You guys are just like sitting by the beach these
calm
days.
Every day. Yeah. I just sit there and I wonder, what should I do? No, I thank you for having me. As you mentioned, I'm in Anthropic. I lead our product public policy team, our sort of programmatic work, particularly around an emerging field of sort of economic impacts of AI, how we think about regulation, particularly outside of the US, which I spend a lot of time here in Europe, as you might imagine, and really excited for this conversation. I think Anthropic is a company that has, we have to act like a big player in a space that the technology is very nascent still. And so I think we are trying to balance a lot of how do we build trust, how do we build safety. It's sort of inherent to our mission at Anthropic, but we have to do it with partners, and we have to do it with people across sectors.
Fantastic. Jon.
Tomicah, thank you for having me here. One of the things that Gallup's working on right now is that this conversation about big data has really taken place in a lot of wealthy countries, but we forget about the fact that there are still pockets where there is no data. And what I mean by that is if you look at sub-Saharan Africa and how many registered births take place every single year, half of them are not registered. In fact, if you think of the DRC has not done a proper census for 40 years. If you aggregate all of this and look at the Sustainable Development Goals, of course there's 17, I think there's 250 some odd indicators, 60% of them for sub-Saharan Africa have no data. And so Gallup has tried to address this, and in 2005, so we've now been doing this for 20 years, we started doing a global study where we could collect data so it's comparable across countries, but that we could give voice to people in countries where they weren't represented or seen, as I think it was the 2019 report said, largely there are 1 or 2 billion people who are invisible to the development community. And so through this initiative known as the Gallup World Poll, where 1/3 of the surveys that we do are on phone, but 2/3 are face-to-face. And these are truly representative samples where we're going out into the rural areas to capture all this critical data. So that's one of the things Gallup's working on, and all of us at Gallup are really proud of it.
That is awesome. Lila, help us get to the next level of understanding that we will need in order to have this conversation. So we were chatting a few minutes ago about a couple of themes that we wanted to cover, and you brought up the critical point. We need to know what we're talking about when it comes to data.
Yeah, in this day and age, we talk intelligence. What is the intelligence? Nobody has defined it for us, Let's define data a little bit. Data, we say data and we mean gazillion different things. So just really simply, there's ground truth. Things that are happening right now that are objective, right? That we can measure physically. It's a phenomenon, and we know that it is occurring, right? Then there's derivative data. How do we interpret it? How do we synthesize it to tell a story, right? That is things that we process as humans. So for example, even if you look at a Wikipedia article, right, or a Google search result, that is already processed by humans. This is not, person A did act B, or, sun has set at this particular time. It is an interpretation of that. And then the third is the synthetic data, which we are now generating en masse with generative AI. And right now, oftentimes we cannot even tell which one is synthetic or not. Just with that as the foundation, I think would be really helpful for us when we start talking about different types of data in this conversation.
So now that we have some of those flavors of data on the table, Jim, what are you doing in your efforts right now to help us assemble data architecture, to help humanity assemble data architecture that is going to be broadly beneficial?
So our biggest project is we do open source software for crisis response helplines. And in many of the kind of countries that Jon's talking about, the National Child Helpline probably has the most data about kids in that country of any organization. But these organizations, again, are, they don't have a lot of money and they're way behind. And so as an example, we're trying to build AI models that work on the way English is spoken in Zimbabwe, say. Because really, overall, the field is working a lot more on North American English than it is on, and then Spanish spoken in a whole bunch of different flavors. And so the idea is how can we actually use that data, not to make money, but to build these models so that the overwhelming need from children is better served by the nonprofit sector. And I think that so much of the of the work that we and our fellow Tech for Good nonprofits do is trying to bring the data culture up in the nonprofit sector, because if you're going to hit the SDGs, you got to know, are we succeeding? Does this program work or not? And then make things better. So that's one thing. And then of course, when you start collecting the data and you don't throw it away, then you can actually start building AI models with it. So that's a lot of what I spend my time talking to is nonprofit leaders, saying, what's your mission dream, and how can software and data actually help you realize it?
So, Jon, I want to come back to the point that you raised a moment ago. We've seen a couple of countries, and India is the most prominent, perhaps, but it's not the only one, that have identified the absence of data as a huge challenge. And they've created entirely new, what are called digital public infrastructure frameworks to solve some of those challenges. They've recognized that if you don't have an identity, and we can extend that to a digital identity, it's really, really hard to do what you need to do in the modern world. Everybody in this room, everybody on this stage certainly has access to a lot of resources and a lot of privileges that folks in many other parts of the planet do not have. But you find occasionally you find people who've been able to come from very, very challenging circumstances and end up in this room or this stage. I've never met anyone who's been able to do that without a digital identity or an identity. And tell us a little bit about how you see solutions emerging in that space. Is there anything that we can do based on and informed by the work that you're involved in that is going to help address the gap that you identified at the top of the conversation?
I think a big part of it is, first, we need to know who has either a digital or a physical identity. And it's remarkable how little of this information exists on a globally comparable basis. And I'll give you an example that's adjacent to this, although not directly related, because before you had to get a driver's license or a passport in a company, you had to get a bank account. And in 2008, I met a woman, her name is Dr. Leora Clapper at the World Bank, and she and I were sitting in Gallup's offices, and she looked at me and she said, "Jon, do you know what % of people around the world have bank accounts?" And I wanted to crawl under a table because I had no idea. And I looked at her and I said, you're the World Bank. Shouldn't you know the answer? And she looked back at me and she said, "No one knows because we don't have the information." And she fixed it. So we worked together. She got a grant from the Gates Foundation. She's now one of the top 100 most cited female economists in the world for a project that's called Findex. It's now the most downloaded microdata set at the World Bank. And she calculates and provides for governments the % of people that have bank accounts in every single country. Because it's really hard to affect policy if you don't know what the current state is. So I think we also need to do that for, first of all, physical identification, but then also virtual identification.
Sarah, help us figure out how that solution set factors into the rapidly emerging world of AI, because we're entering a space right now which is a really exciting space and also a really terrifying space, where we're going to be able to do all of these cool things with AI, but our ability to ensure that the models operate the way we want to operate is to some extent predicated on the inputs that we're going to provide those models and ensuring that those are accurate inputs. And as Jon was saying, we still have a lot of holes that we're going to have to fill. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, again, even though I think people are like, oh, we're here in AI and these models are really powerful. Yeah, they are, and they're getting much more powerful. And so we are still at the early stages. I think there's two aspects to this. There is the training data that goes into frontier models, and that is huge amounts of data that are broadly stuff that is available on the internet, that is in sort of the open space, and we can have a very interesting discussion about sort of what data is out there and who should control it and how you train on it, and I'm sure we'll get there.
We'll go there shortly.
Yeah, and then you have sort of data sets like you're talking about of this woman at the World Bank who maybe she wants to put that into a frontier model because maybe that will actually help solve another problem by another use case. I don't know. Or the World Bank wants to take Claude and implement it there. And they're going to fine tune the model, basically adding their own proprietary data into a model that only works at the World Bank. And so I think you have these sort of two sets of data questions. And I don't think we have answers yet, which is part of the reason we're all here, about what should really go into frontier models to make them the best that they can be across a myriad of industries and solutions that you want to use AI for, versus sort of what do you want to keep proprietary? How do you fine-tune models for very specific use cases?
Lila, you're funding a bunch of companies that are tackling various elements of this right now.
Yeah, I mean, I want to actually expand a little bit on this. The models are very much garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
Like, let's just be honest about that. And they hold the mirror to us as a society. So we take the data that we have, and majority of that is internet data, which is mostly garbage, right? And we put it into the model, and then we get surprised that it's biased or it's inaccurate, or all of these complaints that everybody is seeing. So what we end up doing is we end up taking that ground truth, right, and try to fit it in. So maybe we go in and we manually figure out how many people have bank accounts, things like that. Maybe we use when we synthesize data, and sometimes accurately, sometimes inaccurately. More often than not, we actually pay billions of dollars for people to go and sit there and fill in the gaps, right? We pay experts to go and teach the model effectively, to know what it's supposed to know. I mean, but the reality is the world is incredibly biased. If you look at Wikipedia, it's all Western world, and we had all kinds of programs to actually fill some of the content in different languages. Like there's 350 languages, but let's face it, majority of it is English. So some of the work that we're doing is actually trying to figure out how do you balance all of that, and that's the Stanford work. But from the startup point of view, it's actually very obvious. This very problem exists in microcosm for every single company, every single organization. Before they can do any kind of AI, they need their data to be in a decent shape. It needs to be not garbage. We actually at Microsoft, I was deputy CTO for Microsoft for the last 7 years. So one of the papers that we published is textbooks is all you need, as a sort of homage to the famous paper, which is attention is all you need, which kind of launched this incredible wave in 2018. It was published at Google, and the reality of that is we need good data, we need clear data, and we need to spend time and attention to get the ground truth that you are talking about, because without it, we're going to have more garbage out. That's my take on that.
Yesterday from the stage, we heard a great quote by the investor Charlie Munger, which all of you are familiar with, who said once, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes." And right now, we don't have, I think it's fair to say, great incentives to create really awesome data. There's some organizations that do this. Gallup creates really awesome data. But there are not many organizations that are creating really awesome data. And I think part of the challenge is most of the data that we need to drive these models is going to come from all of us. We're seeing that already. A lot of it has already been ingested into the models. But we are going to need to, each of us, be providing data if we want to get good outputs.
Well, we have to be careful with that, because the data that we're ingesting is the data used to basically extract more out of us.
Exactly.
Right? That's like, come on, like,
this is precisely.
That's not quite the data that we really want. What we want is, for example, health data. We want to be able to correlate a bunch of health data to drive health outcomes, for example, which is inaccessible.
But let's double click on this dynamic for a moment, because we do not have, I think it's fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, we do not have good incentives as individuals to provide good data into these models.
We get free. Yeah, that's true. So, for example, at Microsoft, we started this program called Data Dignity, and I actually pitched it to a bunch of model providers. And what that data basically did is said, okay, we're going to take data from everybody, and we're going to label who is giving us this data, right? Because in many cases, people can give us some really good data. Like Wikipedians provide excellent data to Wikipedia for everybody's benefit. And then we're going to create a share effectively, right? So if the data is used in a query, right, you get, I don't know, some percentage of a cent eventually, right? And the better of the data that you provide, and there's some data sets that are extremely rare, that are extremely, very much needed, right? Like you were describing, then those people are actually going to benefit from the economy, from the AI economy that is going to explode. I just wish that we would do that. And by the way, it would also benefit us with respect to truth, because if right now we're trying to identify is this AI generated or not, why not say majority of the stuff is going to be AI generated? Why not label it? Lila said this. Right? So if you want to know who generated that particular point, label it as human generated, and then go to that human, because that human should stand behind the data that they have provided.
Every big, very, very powerful point. Every major expansion of economic opportunity in history has generally been accompanied by the expansion of new rights around ownership and new rights around how we assign economic value. So, if you look back to private property and kind of the emergence of private property, which brought us out of feudalism, if you look at the creation of the joint stock company, these were evolutions and innovations in rights that ended up having a really profound transformational impact on our ability to aggregate capital and do cool stuff as a species. And so I want the three of you to provide a little perspective on this, because you're all coming at this from different angles. But I'd like at a high level, and we'll get to solutions in a little bit, to start thinking about what good looks like in a world where we have more data rights and better incentives to create awesome data that will power awesome tools that benefit us. And I imagine, Jon, you all are thinking about this a great deal at Gallup and the intersection of the work that you do and AI. What's good look like in 5-10 years? How do we get to a better place?
If you don't mind, you asked a question about do we have the right incentives? I just want to make two comments on that really quickly. Do we have the right incentives for the people that are participating in giving data? And I don't know I think that's the right question for a lot of wealthy countries. But what's really remarkable in a lot of developing economies, when we go and do face-to-face interviews, we knock on doors, what are response rates? Because in America, if you call someone, the response rates are very low. I mean, there are some firms that'll get less than 5%. But in developing economies, you can get upwards of 80% participation. And one hypothesis is that no one's asked their thoughts on things before. And so they're actually very eager to say, let me tell you about my daily experience. In fact, we'll have other members of the community that'll say, you can come to my house when you're done, because I'd like to share my opinions too. When the tribal chief says that, you comply. Now, of course, that doesn't follow
that doesn't happen when you guys call people in the United States. Yeah.
Snowballing.
So if you said to me, Jon, what's the real barrier to that? It's not necessarily participation. Yes, that is the case in many wealthy countries, Japan, the United States, etc. It's money. You look at overseas development assistance, it's less than 1% that gets spent on the actual data to understand, are we making things better in whatever investments it is that we're actually trying to affect real change. I think another thing is the private sector, when they're making any sort of their sustainable commitments, data is not the most attractive thing. You either want to make the investments in BedNet, something that might get a photo so that, somebody's not criticizing your company. But an investment in data, it's not the most attractive thing in the world, and it's really hard to sell. And the last thing I would say that's a barrier, and this one's pretty brutal, and it's only because we get criticized so much for it. Rightly so, we're very open to criticism, but the lack of data literacy, specifically among leaders, is quite remarkable. And I say that because, people will say things like, well, I don't know, they when they use the word pollster, they do it in a bit of a disparaging way. And they say, you need to get hard data. And I always wonder, when you say hard data, what are you talking about? Do you mean unemployment data? And they go, that's the kind of data we need. And I go, do you know how that's measured? And by the way, then you can see they're getting nervous when you say it. And you say, That's a survey of 60,000 people by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, at least in the United States, and most do that as well. And when the International Labor Organization goes and canvasses around the world, they find whatever the Central Statistics Office actually has, and if they don't, they often make projections. If we look at data from HIV/AIDS, even that we're kind of making estimates. Those aren't precise numbers that we're looking at. That's okay. That's very good. We got to get as close as we can in order to make things improve. But again, one of the challenges is financing, the attractiveness, and data literacy.
All right.
I didn't answer your question. I
you
don't
did
remember
not.
what you
We're
asked
hoping,
me, but-
Sarah, the stakes have gone up for you.
I don't know about-
It was a good answer, but not an answer to the question.
I don't know if this is like where you wanted to go with it, but I'll just put it on the table. I mean, I think some of the issue, particularly in building AI models, is who wants to give their data and who does not want to give their data. And I think that there is a huge amount of incentive to give data, but that is often sort of painted with a sort of anti-privacy brush. And I'm not saying that there is not valid arguments there, but I think we need to sort of look more holistically, at how models are trained. So, for instance, like if you, like your personal data goes into a model training with millions of other data points, and then, oh, by the way, it's tokenized. So it's not about what you exactly said. It's like, what's the next thing in the model? And so I think there's sort of like this privacy aspect, and then there's this aspect of like, hey, we should be going to universities, and we should be going to Gallup, and we should have the best survey data, and we should be putting them in models, and that incentivizes everybody to have a better experience. And so I don't think that we've gotten the incentives right yet. I also think personal incentives and community and sort of sector incentives have been necessarily aligned. And I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about how data actually is used in AI models. Just like one example is, I am dealing with the Brazilian government on some regulatory issues that they're doing, and they're like, well, we are not represented in Claude, and like we need more localized Brazilian Portuguese stuff. And I was like, well, Claude actually can pass the equivalent of your bar exam, so I think it's pretty good in Portuguese. But that is because we've been able to ingest data to represent this community. Now, the other side of this is we have a lot of communities that very rightly are sort of maybe indigenous communities or smaller communities, and they're saying, hey, we want you to put data sets into your model for Quechua or whatever the language is. And I'm like, you don't have a data set for me to give. I can go to our people and they're very happy to do it, but your data isn't in a format that we can actually ingest yet. And so I think part of this challenge is like, how do we talk across sort of the technological divide to get the right data in, and then also sort of making sure models are saying, when this is a fact, like this is where this fact came from. Oftentimes I'll go to Claude and I'm asking about whatever it is and say, can you tell me where you got that? And unless it can come back and say, yeah, it's from here, then I'm like, okay, that's a fact. Great. I can use it in my briefing document or whatever it is. So I think that there's like evolution of trading data. I think there's evolution of how we incentivize people to actually want to put data into models, and also how we actually see the products put outputs out.
So Jim, building on that,
Yeah.
I heard a statistic yesterday that at one level should not have shocked me, and yet it still shocked me, which is that we are going to spend $1 billion a day over the next year on investment in AI.
Yeah.
That is an extraordinary amount of resource. You spoke a few minutes ago about the paucity of resources in the space where you operate when it comes to implementing these technologies. How do we bridge the divide between what Jon and Sarah are talking about and the world that you want to create?
Well, I mean, there's a wide range of data and things that we can do with it. And in the social sector, there's a lot of other value propositions that are at work, right? I mean, medical research, right? I mean, it may not be financial, but it might lead to a cure of a disease that affects you or your kids. So people are excited about medical data being used to actually understand things better. And so when you spend $1 billion a day, you're not spending it in Zimbabwe or in Bhutan, right? That's just because the economics aren't there. So one of the ways you do this is you try to lever.
Well, maybe we should, based on what John is
Well,
saying.
I
Maybe
mean,
we'd get much better results.
We would, but it's hard to find the economics. I mean, maybe you found a revenue model that actually pays for that, but by and large, it's hard, right? Because by and large, your average tech company is not rushing into 80% of the world's countries. So the way that we look at this is, the technology is advancing really rapidly. The investments are being made. These models are being built, and we piggyback on those giant investments to apply this to different needs. So, I started my career, we built character recognition. That was the leading edge of AI a few decades ago. Lawyers bought it. The Postal Service used it to route the mail. There were commercial applications. The social good application was reading machines for the blind. And my venture capitalist vetoed my reading machine for the blind idea for excellent business reasons, because the market was $1 million a year, and they'd put $25 million in my company. But because they'd put $25 million in my company, when I left to start a nonprofit to help the blind, they gave us the technology for free. 80% of the time when I ask a tech company to give us their technology for a market they're not going to go after, i.e., the poor, they're all over it. And so there's just to use, your kind of model. Most of the countries we work with don't have a lot of data on, let's say, Zimbabwe, right? But they have enough data that we can bootstrap a pretty decent model to do categorization and summarization of crisis response calls. We can bootstrap that building on top of one of these big models. Even though it wasn't trained on Zimbabwean English or local languages, we can actually do a good enough job with that bootstrapping approach. So that's always what I'm doing, is I'm scouting for, that's really cool technology. It's making some money. As a matter of fact, if it doesn't make money, it won't be around in a couple of years. So, but if you can be making money, I would love to borrow it for this really cool application in human rights, the environment, education, disability, whatever it might be.
So, Lila, I'm reflecting as Jim talks on the work that you did at Wikipedia. Wikipedia is this really anomalous organization in a lot of respects, because you've gotten lots of people, and raise your hand if you use Wikipedia on a regular basis. We all use Wikipedia on a regular basis. Lots of people use Wikipedia. Raise your hand if you contribute to Wikipedia, if you've ever contributed to Wikipedia. So quite a few people contribute to Wikipedia, and yet there aren't clear incentives to do that. I've contributed to Wikipedia, but there aren't really good incentives for me to contribute to Wikipedia. Knowing what you know, and you have, I think, a really unique perspective on this about both the universe of resource that is available, and you're deploying some of those resources now, and the dynamics that exist around mass mobilization to generate good data. What do we need to solve for to start putting these pieces together?
Yeah, so Wikipedia is very, very unique. So typically, I completely agree with Jim. Economics trumps everything, right? And if economics isn't there, forget it. When Wikipedia happened, by the way, it was a fluke, right? The idea was, I don't know how many of you know the history, but originally the team wanted to create an encyclopedia. They wanted to create, basically, they wanted to do it for it to be written by professionals. Mm-hmm. They put a server up, they started writing articles. They weren't moving fast enough, so they put a second server up and said, you know what, we will use it as a feeder and we'll let anybody create articles. By the end of the first year, they had like 20 on one and 20,000 on the other, and the rest was history, right? And Wikipedia to this day has an anti-specialist kind of vibe, right? It's mostly written by people who are not specialists in the field, but they were all organized around this idea of creating knowledge, creating an encyclopedia, which is a very clear concept on the web for everyone, that can be reachable for everyone. So that democratization, that spirit was really important, but Wikipedia didn't make it on their own. Google had it as a top of search result. It got the distribution through Google. It was the top of search result for a very long time, and that self-reinforcing loop ultimately what created this particular phenomenon. And it doesn't mean that it can't exist again or can create. In fact, when I was there, the idea was that we'll use AI to actually accelerate it into different languages, accelerate it into better search results, right? And to accelerate that loop. right? It's very difficult to do that, but it is possible, right? People do want to contribute. On Wikipedia, we run these projects where people go around and take pictures just because we put on top, we need a picture of this monument, and somebody goes and takes a picture. Amazing. Distribution needed. Somebody needs to see this, right? So these kind of things only work when you have the right distribution to the right community, right? And how do we get here from our current situation where social media is designed to understand what we actually want, right? To get the data, not the interesting data that we need for the models, right? But the kind of data of like, what do we like to buy? Where do we like to go? You know, like all of our like nitty gritty stuff so that they can sell us more. Right, that is the environment that we're in, and then that very social media now on steroids with AI is just going to reprogram us, right? Because we are programmable machines. Yeah. Let's not forget that an AI is going to be damn good at reprogramming us, way better than social media, right? Is to reprogram us for economic value, and this is the crux of the problem that I think we should be dealing with right now when we talk about dangers of AI. Is how do we figure out how do we stay intentional in what we want to be as humans and align AI to that, our personal AI, as the AI starts to progress, as opposed to let companies use economic value to extract whatever they want out of it. So whether we can get to another version of a data-based system where people share data. I don't know how many of you know that behind Wikipedia there is a structured data source actually that got born much later than Wikipedia itself, that people actually actively contribute to. It's called Wikidata, right? But it just doesn't have enough distribution for all of you to contribute every day, and you don't see your contribution reflected back to you, which is extremely important for all of us. We want a mission. We want to know that what we have done counts. In fact, like a lot of times, people will change a comma in an article, correct it, and that's their entry, into making a little contribution to something that's bigger than us. We need something like that. Maybe it's an open model like that.
So we want all of you to contribute to the open model of this conversation, and we're going to turn to you for questions in just a moment. Before we do that, I want to quickly come back to one piece of this that you brought up, Lila, which I think is really, really interesting and important. Right now, if we want to be in a world where we have control over our own information, and we're not being reprogrammed by these models, we're actually being proactive and deliberate in how we engage with them, we're going to have to shift some things. And Project Liberty, as some folks may be aware, is currently bidding for the US assets of TikTok. And part of our vision for that is to shift TikTok over the long term from the current attention-based economy that dominates the platform and lots of other platforms today to an intention-based economy. And rather than having an economic engine that's grounded in making the content as addictive as possible and then selling advertisement to monetize that addiction, you instead give people the chance to proactively and consciously identify the type of experiences, content, goods, and services with which they would like to interact, and then you allow them to curate their own feed and the content that they are going to be viewing on that basis. Are there lessons that we should take, and I'll ask this as an open question for any of you as we go about that process, and this is obviously a selfish question, but hopefully it has broader implications.
I don't want to.
Well, I'll jump on that one. One of the major ag research funders in the United States asked us to invent HIPAA for farmers. And HIPAA is our medical privacy law. And I went, what are you talking about? And she said, right now, as climate is changing, we need data from farmers to figure out what's working and not working in agriculture. And right now, farmers are cooperating with data collection less and less. And I said, and this is at the beginning of one of our projects that we hadn't really, why? Well, because every time they share their data, they get screwed, right? My first interview with a prospective user of our software in Africa explained the concept of data colonialism to me. I didn't know it. And he's like, you're from Silicon Valley. Get a clue, dude. Because
we call it data feudalism.
Yeah, exactly. But in both cases, when people show up with data, the default setting of most of Silicon Valley is we extract your data and we give you a token benefit, and we program you to do that. But so the nonprofit sector is pretty well trusted as a set of institutions, and it's not driven by making a lot of money. And so one of the things that we did, we went out and said, how do we, as a social sector, as government, as nonprofits, as businesses that are not in extractive data collection, how do we do this? And so we're working on something that's like open source or Creative Commons, but for data that shouldn't be made public. And it's called the Better Deal for Data, and we're co-designing it with the social sector right now, very much inspired by a lot of the same kind of things. It's like, what if the primary interest in data collection was the benefit of the individual, but in most of the world, it's the community and the country that people really want to benefit and would be willing to contribute to that rather than enriching Silicon Valley tech companies. So anyway, this is an exciting movement. Many nonprofits are already signing up saying, yes, we want a better deal for data. And a lot of nonprofits don't know what to do with the data, and they're collecting data from vulnerable people about the thing that makes them vulnerable, and they don't even safeguard the data. They don't know they're supposed to. So the idea is to come up with a set of principles where it's like, handle the data ethically, use it to benefit the community that you're serving, don't sell it to Meta.
On that happy note.
On that happy note.
Let us turn to this crowd. Olivier.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your perspective on data standardization, whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about whether we're likely to see improvements in that area. That's going to certainly support a lot of the AI models, but enable much better research, whether it's health or some of the other sectors.
Do we really need it?
Actually, I'll take it real quick. I mean, I think standardization is really hard in this world. I mean, look at, USB ports and things like that, right? I mean, we're still fighting that good fight. But I actually don't think we're going to need it, because we're going to have AI to normalize the data for us. And that's like the 101, it's not as good as it needs to be right now, but it's going to get there.
The other piece of that, well, anyone else want to opine on that? I think there's going to be an enormous opportunity around data portability that is something we're spending a lot of time and energy on at Project Liberty, and we've created a new infrastructure layer called Frequency that's specifically designed to facilitate individual control of data and then the data portability that comes with that. But that, I think, can also help in some elements of this.
Maybe I'll just jump in onto that. I think there's standardization of data, but there's also standardization of regulation of data.
Yeah.
And I fear
You say that as though we don't do that really, really well in the world right now.
We
Sarah.
don't. The Europeans have a model. We can decide if that's a good model or not a good model. But I fear that if one country or block of countries regulates it one way, and another block regulates it very differently, and then you start to have only data from certain types of countries or communities, it has a very, you think you're doing the right thing, except for now you're excluding data sets or data inputs that are actually really critical. And I think I think as Europe in particular grapples with this, I think there needs to be some cognition of sort of what is the ancillary effects.
I just want to build on what Sarah's absolutely right. Misregulation of data is more problematic than not regulating it at all. I mean, what you're describing basically is cutting out pieces of data from particularly model construction, and then model is effectively blind to, and we do this by doing so intentionally, right, as opposed to unintentionally, like we do, because we don't have that data. So that's very, very dangerous. And in general, we just have to be very careful with regulation, because regulation as it's written, like we thought we were doing a lot of good with GDPR, and the net result of it is that all of us are just clicking through this, pop-up boxes that are huge nonsense and annoyance, and the providers are collecting just as much or even more of our data. So like regulation is a huge problem.
To public trust. I mean, it's like, the European Union thought that they were doing a great thing with GDPR to build public trust, and everybody hates them even more for those stupid boxes. Like, I call it the California DMV problem. Like, if you want government services to work for you, like AI can help government services work for you. Now we need to do it right, and that doesn't mean that there's not guardrails that we can put around it. But like, I think trust building should be the thing that we optimize for with AI.
Well, and I'll be a somewhat contrarian here. There is the idea of rights. The average European thinks that they have some rights in their data, and the average American has no clue, right? And a lot. We were actually inspired by the idea of GDPR as opposed to the bureaucratic bullshit of GDPR, right? But the idea is really strong. It gives some rights, and in practice, no one exercises those rights, as you just identified, right? But the fact that they have rights means that someone who highly abuses those rights can be held accountable, and that's the beginning of building trust. Because right now, I think that the tech industry is losing trust. It's going to be a very interesting 4 years in the U.S.
Well, and part of the challenge also is that we have had regulatory solutions that in many cases have been advanced on a totally different track from the technical solutions. And so, in an ideal world, and this is a world that we are working hard to create, rather than us having to click on the terms of service for all of the platforms that we are engaged in, they're clicking on our terms of service. Each of us individually can set our terms of service. And that technology exists, like we can solve that problem, but we need to start lining up our legal code and our technical code.
I actually don't think it exists. Like, we talk about.
Then we should chat after this.
Well, I don't think it exists across the board. I think that there are certain companies that build proprietary ways of doing this, and then they are like, well, we do it better, and then they don't let other companies use it. So it's like, it needs to be machine readable. It needs to be interoperable. It needs to be feasible, and the codes need to be able to evolve with the technology. Because today, we talk about like watermarking AI outputs. Okay, well, we can sort of do it ish in image. There will be people that tell you we can do it in text, but it's very bad. And we know that there's going to be evolution in that. So we shouldn't have the standard be here when the feasibility is here, but we also need to like build space for that and build it to the back end. Everybody can play by the same rules.
Good call. All right, next question. Right here, please. And
Hello.
If you don't mind, tell us who you are as you're asking your question.
My name is Nadia. I'm a friend of Olivier as of yesterday at the Stanford Center for Party.
That's a good qualification for asking the question.
Yes. So I wanted to know how you guys are dealing with AI that is trained on generated AI or even fake data. It's common. And actually, I read a statistic in a pitch deck about how soon most of the internet will be based on generated data. It skews your Google, it skews your ChatGPT results, and I would just love to know what you guys are thinking.
We don't train on generated data. I mean, we don't train on user inputs, and we don't train on the outputs that come out of Claude. I think it will be an evolving sector. I don't know. This is like Sarah's personal view, but I also think like we want creators to create content. I don't think that there is going to be a world where humans don't ever create content again. And I think that's good.
That would be a very sad world.
It would be a very sad world, but I think there are some people that are like, oh, there's just going to be all this synthetic data and that's all that you will train on. And like, again, I could be completely wrong. I don't know what the world is going to look like, but I think we need to continue to create content, to have humans put things out there, and then hopefully train on that.
But does that require reinforcing copyright protections and kind of digital property protections for the humans who you want to be creating that content?
I think it depends on which content creators you ask, because I think there are some content creators out there that are extremely scared, which is totally understandable. And then I think there are some that are like, wow, this is like really accelerating my ability to be creative, and I understand how models are built, and I'm understanding that like my one piece of content is not actually going to be a direct output in a model. And so I think there's like some education. I think that there's some sort of rules of the road that we need to create. Like I think there's multiple prongs here to get to the right answer.
So it's going to come down to licensing, right? And today creators don't actually understand how to license their content properly, right? And if it's under Creative Commons license, obviously model can use it. If it's under proprietary license, then not. But I want to answer your question more technically. So there's such thing as called model collapse. Model collapse occurs when the model is trained on synthetic data, and you have to be very careful on how you use it. However, most model providers do use synthetic data, and here's why. The physics of the world abides certain rules, right? I don't necessarily need to take a picture of this room. I can actually model it in silico, right? And then I can use the output of that model, and it can be very, very precise, right? Because I modeled exactly where the light is, the color of the light, the angles, the shape of the ceiling, et cetera, right? I can automatically generate it in computer graphics, and then I can load that into the model to use for training. I can do this with weather patterns. I can do it with so many things. And of course, we train on synthetic data, but it's you have to be very, very careful how you use it.
I think there's one other piece to your question, because we're really concerned about what the threats are, but there's also a huge opportunity that AI presents to us in two ways. I mean, one, we've all seen in the past 2 years, actually more than the past 2 years, where a number of academics have been caught faking data. In fact, there's one estimate that says that across all disciplines, 2% of all research is just straight up made up.
Yep.
And the second piece is the amount of bias that exists. I mean, even in the journals, they say that there's a bias toward kind of a surprising finding, as opposed to, if you do a bunch of research and you go, well, everybody kind of looks the same. That's actually information, but it may not have gotten published because somebody might say, well, was that interesting? And so then we see a lot of that potentially, misinforming in a number of different ways. I give all of that context because AI gives us another option to say, how do we uncover those biases? For example, somebody did text analytics on the biases that economists have and actually uncovered whether or not they leaned conservative or leaned liberal. And being able to see that is quite useful, because maybe somebody would have seen the exact same data set and would have come up with a different conclusion. So I think there are huge opportunities for us as well to use AI to help us kind of go back to say, were we even getting some of this stuff right in the first place? And that's okay, because if we weren't, that too is a massive learning from society. And as long as all of us can learn from it and improve, then it was a really great thing that AI did for us.
I love that, John. Please.
Hi, my name is Manoj Gursani. I'm a co-founder of a healthcare startup. So one of the aspects which you mentioned about non-profit, so I'll take a context in healthcare for good.
Yeah.
Okay, so cancer, oral, breast, cervical cancer, these are three things which are at least dominating the world stage, and India specific. So we do, there are a lot of not-for-profit who do data, real ground work to build, which would help to build the ground truth. So the question is that data could be anonymized, and so that it's for cure, early detection, prevention, etc. But there has to be some way for not-for-profits to get monetized to be sustainable, because there are cost of doing that on-ground work. There is a cost.
Yeah.
So if you don't want them to sell data to metadata or etc. of all these other giants and do it for good, then there has to be a solution for that and some platform where they can offer that data.
It's one of the biggest issues in the better deal for data conversations, right? Because data costs money.
Sure.
And now analyzing data costs money. At the same time, we see nonprofits handing over the data of their constituents to for-profits, and scandals result, right? So the question is, how do you do that ethically? So, and the medical field is the pinnacle in the nonprofit sector of using data, and we have things that respect the privacy of the individual, but generate science, and then pharma can go off and build drugs, or we can have better treatment. So we have working models of how this works, but there are some really signal examples of bad monetization. Now, you collect data from poor people, don't sell it to the fintech industry, the exploitative part of the fintech industry that's going to use it to make them poorer, but maybe sell it to or cooperate with an effort like India's to expand access to economics. So context matters a lot in what's good monetization, what's bad monetization, and it's a hard thing to draw that line.
And I would love to see the data model like Data Dignity work, because in that case, your patients who have donated the data would have been earmarked as that. You create a provenance chain. You can do it on blockchain or whatever, however you want, right? It's earmarked that it belongs to somebody and could be completely anonymous. And when that data is finally used for, let's say, drug creation, that patient gets paid. Right? So now you can create all kinds of financial instruments to create loans, to finance that, right? So that your nonprofit gets paid in advance, right, of that discovery by that,
I mean, this
biopharma.
goes to the core of Project Liberty's mission, which is to build an internet where people have a choice in how their data is used, a voice in how platforms operate, and a stake in the economic value that they create online. And there are, again, I think we see an array of emerging solutions that are going to enable us to build that world, but we're going to have to get pretty deliberate about making that happen pretty rapidly. We have time, I hope, for one more very quick question. Please.
Hi, my name is Jose Jacob. I'm from Bangalore. I run a forum called the Future ICT Forum for Sustainable Cities. Last time we had a speaker from Liberty also at Bangalore at our event. We have seen a tremendous increase thanks to what the other speaker mentioned about digital ID, bank accounts, and so on in India, and QR code based payments. Last year in the first half, we had about 80 billion transactions which were done with QR code. In the past, they were done by cash. These are micro transactions, less than $1, $2. So only 2 people knew what transaction happened. But with the digital trail of these 80 billion transactions in the last year's first half, there's huge data and people know what's in demand, what's not in demand. And we are kind of seeing the emergence of flow-based credit instead of asset-based credit. Just want to pick your brains on what you think about this, anything to watch out for. There are a lot of good things we can see, but is there anything to watch out for? Thank you.
I have one thought on this, but any thoughts, responses on that?
Well, your point about India's rapid adoption of bank accounts, I mean, because India accounts for almost 1/7 of the world's population, it changed the entire database. I mean, the rapid adoption of bank accounts just in India actually caused the entire project to start to diversify to capture some other projects because it worked so well. And again, I think this is why when you actually get data behind something, people start working toward it and you see amazing things take place. That said, there was the famous economist, I think it was Goodhart, and it's now Goodhart's law, that we have to make sure that we don't have just one indicator that we watch. Otherwise, that one indicator ceases to be a valuable indicator because we either start to manipulate it or we go just to achieve whatever that given number is, and we kind of ignore everything else. So you asked if there's anything that we would caution against, it would be that.
One quick codicil, and then we will wrap. There's an Indian state that is very, very sophisticated in how it has been leveraging data. And they noticed a while back that they were seeing a spike in diabetes. So people had been sharing anonymized health information. There was a significant uptick in diabetes. And so they quickly went to work figuring out how you address that. They shifted from distributing white rice as part of their food distribution scheme to distributing brown rice as part of the food distribution scheme. Diabetes rates plummeted, and they saved themselves a staggering amount of money that would otherwise have gone toward treating diabetes. And I think that's an example of the type of problem you can solve when you do have access to good data. But it's going to be really, really important to ensure that people have agency and an understanding of how that information is being utilized and under what circumstances. With that, any final words from our amazing panelists?
I just would encourage all of you to demand your rights back. Your
Amen.
data is yours. Take it back. Demand that we have the zero trust policies when we talk about cybersecurity. We should have a zero donation policy when it comes to your data. Anytime you give it away, it should be because you explicitly choose to give it. And yes, it's going to break a lot of business models for a lot of companies. So, I'm not going to be very well liked, but demand your rights back.
And my statement is 90% of humanity needs to benefit from these great technologies, and we just need to find a way to make that happen. And I think we will.
Sarah.
Maybe this is like a call to action. I feel like we are in the early days of figuring out how to use data to solve a lot of these problems and using AI specifically to do it. So if people have good ideas, organizations that you're working with that have the technical capacity on the other end that would like to work with us to solve some of these problems, we're looking for opportunities to do that.
Jon, take us home.
Well, in 3 weeks' time, Gallup's going to be launching a report because we did an ambitious project where we went to the world and we said, tell us about a leader in your life that gives you positive energy. Once the respondent told us who that was, we said, what is it that you get from them? And the reason it was a bit ambitious is because all of it was open-ended, and those that do open-end research know it gets very difficult to code these things, so we're using AI. And so we're coming out with the results on what is it the world needs from leaders. And so I would just encourage everyone, because I know I do personally, but all of us, can use a bit of growth when it comes to listening. But this is one way to listen to people, to the world's 8 billion citizens, to say what is it that they need most from leaders. So we'd encourage you to check that out. Thank you.
Well, on that topic, it's been a privilege listening to the four of you for this conversation. Please join me in giving a huge round of applause for Jon, Sarah, Jim, and Lila.